So my name is Mariah Belyea, and I am a wetland biologist with the Department of Environment and Local Government, and I am going to be talking about the Watercourse and Wetland Alteration Program, and particularly focusing on forested wetlands. So the WAWA program is administered by the Watercourse and Wetland Alteration Branch through the Department of Environment and Local Government. We are governed by the New Brunswick Clean Water Act, which covers the WAWA regulation and the wetland conservation policy. So within the WAWA regulation, it states that a WAWA permit is required for an alteration in or within 30 meters of a watercourse or wetland as per the definitions outlined in the Clean Water Act. So I'll just go over some definitions here. So definition of a watercourse is defined as the bed, banks, and sides of any incised channel greater than 0.5 meters in width that displays a rock or soil bed. Water flow does not have to be continuous, and it may be absent during any time of year, or it can be a natural or man-made basin. And a wetland is defined as a water table that is at, near, or above the land surface, or land which is saturated for a long enough period to promote wetland or aquatic processes as indicated by hydric soils and hydrophytic vegetation. So the legal definition of an alteration is a temporary or permanent change made in or within 30 meters of a watercourse or wetland. And this can include soil disturbance, including deposit or removal of materials, removal of vegetation, and disturbance in flow, including water withdrawal. So the Department of Environment regulates all wetlands as they appear on the ground. So that means whether they are mapped or not. So any wetland which meets the definition in the Clean Water Act. So you can search your address or your PID number on the WAWA reference map to see if there are any mapped watercourses or wetlands on your property. But you should note that the WAWA reference map or GONB, they're available on both of those sites. It is just a reference tool. So that is why we regulate based on what's on the map and also what's on the ground, because it's almost impossible to have all of the watercourses and wetlands in New Brunswick mapped. So what is a wetland? So a wetland is a transitional area between land and water. They're typically wet for 2 consecutive weeks during the growing season. They have hydric soils, and they support plant species adapted to wet conditions. And these can be plant communities that are non-forested, forested, or shrub. So some general wetland specifications. Wetlands that are greater than 1 hectare in size or which are contiguous to a watercourse are regulated, and they require a WAWA permit before commencement of an alteration in or within 30 meters. Any wetland that is less than 1 hectare in size and is not contiguous to a watercourse does not require a WAWA permit. And this is all based on the boundary present on the ground. So as I mentioned, you can check out the WAWA reference map, which is publicly available, or other sources such as GONB. To check out if there are already any mapped features on your property. So these are some examples of non-forested wetlands that we have in New Brunswick. So there are bogs, fens, coastal marshes, aquatic beds, and freshwater marshes. And the forested and shrub wetlands that we have are the forested wetland floodplain, forested bogs, shrub swamps, and alder thickets. And these are typically the more difficult wetlands to identify, especially for the public, because there's generally not standing water, especially in forested wetlands, which does make it more difficult to identify. So forested wetlands are areas where the water table is at or near the surface, and soil conditions are water saturated, or their standing water is present with at least 30% of the surface area covered by woody vegetation greater than 6 meters in height that is at least partially rooted within the wetland. And some characteristics that you can ask yourself if you're not sure if you're in a forested wetland, or even if you do know you're in a forested wetland, you can look for some of these characteristics. So do you see any natural drainage routes which are defined by a small channel or scouring? Is the ground soggy or spongy under your foot anytime during the growing season, typically from May to September? Is sphagnum moss present? And this is usually what creates the soggy or spongy feel when you're walking. Are there low spots or depressions where water pools for more than 10 days during the growing season? Does the ground have areas of depressions and mounds? Do you see any springs or seeps? Do you see areas that cannot be crossed by a vehicle, tractor, or other machinery because it might get stuck in the soft wet ground. And this is a good one to keep in mind because usually we try to ask people this, like if you would hesitate to drive machinery or a truck through that area, whether it's a forested wetland or not, then you're likely in a wetland if you think that you're probably going to get stuck. Do you see any water-stained leaves on the ground, such as the one in this photo? You can see the dark black stained leaves compared to the dry leaf that's there. And do you see any fine silt or sediment deposits on the leaves that are on the ground or the stems or tree trunks? So some more characteristics of forested wetlands. Do you see drift lines where sticks, leaves, or other water-carried debris have lodged against the base of vegetation? Do you see any of these herbaceous plants, such as sensitive fern, cinnamon fern, jewelweed, or jack-in-the-pulpit, which you can see in the photos over to the left? Do you see any of these shrubs, mountain holly, speckled alder, Labrador tea, or red osier dogwood? Do you see any of these trees present? Black ash, willow, red maple, silver maple, larch or tamarack, yellow or gray birch, black spruce, or eastern white cedar? Do you see a black organic layer, which may look like decomposing leaves and roots, below the surface that is at least 4 inches thick? And if you dig a pit to a depth of 18 inches, does it fill with water or does water trickle down the inside? You may need to wait a few minutes to actually see this happen. So this is usually what we do, like a certified wetland delineator will do when we're delineating a wetland. We'll actually dig a soil pit to see what the soil looks like and to see what the water table, what's going on with the water table, especially if there isn't any standing water to observe. So a few different types of forested wetlands in New Brunswick include the forested floodplain wetland. So these are typically dominated by floodplain or flood-tolerant silver maples along the lower St. John River floodplain. Other treed species include white elm, red or green ash, basswood, and red oak. And some at-risk species in this area includes bur oak, black willow, and butternut. So floodplain forests are among the most converted and the least protected ecosystems in North America, largely due to development that happens in the floodplain. They have rich alluvial soil composition, and the understory is typically dominated by sensitive fern, stinging nettle, and dwarf raspberry. So there's a photo on the left of a nice example of a silver maple floodplain forest. So a few other types, we have forested swamps, which can be cedar dominated, and these usually have rich mineral soil nutrients. The understory consists of Canada mayflower, cinnamon fern, creeping snowberry, starflower, wild sarsaparilla, and mountain holly. You can also have black spruce and tamarack dominated swamps, which also have poor soil nutrients. So they have a thick layer of organics with standing water or stagnant water. And the understory consists of bog rosemary, leatherleaf, Labrador tea, and sphagnum moss. We also have black ash, red maple, balsam fir, and yellow birch forested swamps. They have medium soil nutrients, and the understory can be varied, but can include, I keep clicking to go to the next one. And they can include speckled alder, red osier dogwood, mountain holly, and wood sorrel. So I just wanted to touch base on provincially significant wetlands, so PSWs. So floodplain wetlands that intercept designated flood risk areas are considered provincially significant wetlands. Development and land use activities within these wetlands are subject to strict regulations to maintain their ecological integrity and additional protection due to their critical role. They are defined as having provincial, national, or international importance. So PSWs are classified based on several criteria, which include coastal marshes. So all coastal marshes in the province are PSW, but they can also be areas that have important bird habitat, species at risk habitat, and have significant hydrologic value, such as flood mitigation. And they must meet the size specifications as mentioned earlier. So for wetlands especially in Fredericton and the St. John region, any type of wetland that intercepts the flood layer, so the flood risk layer, which you can view on GONB or the WAWA reference map, is automatically designated as a PSW. And there are very strict regulations of activities that are allowed in and within 30 meters of PSW, which includes soil disturbance, so any type of development, any type of harvesting or vegetation removal, there are pretty limited activities that are permitted. So some examples of when a standard WAWA permit would be required include, but are not limited to, the removal of all merchantable timber in or within 30 meters of a forested wetland, and removal of 30% or more of merchantable trees within 30 meters of a non-forested wetland. So within a forested wetland, you are permitted to remove all merchantable timber, but if you're within 30 meters of a non-forested wetland, so such as like a shrub, wetland, or a marsh, you can only remove 30% within that 30-meter buffer. And that also applies for watercourses. You can only remove 30% of merchantable timber within 30 meters of the watercourse. So WAWA applications are submitted online. Typically, these would involve standard applications, but for harvesting, you can submit a provisional, certification, renewal, and revision. And the online application form will walk you through the steps so you can decide which type of permit is best suited for your activity. And we do consult with other programs or agencies once we receive the WAWA permit application. So they get reviewed by Watershed and Wellfields Division, approval to operate, environmental impact assessment, DFO. So automatically, if there's any in-water works involved, we send it to DFO for their review, crown lands, and species at risk. So we only send the application for review if it gets triggered that if the activities are going to affect one of these other branches that might need to review, then we would also send it to them for their feedback. So working in or within 30 meters of a wetland, so this is only for non-PSW wetlands because most of the activities that I just mentioned, or yeah, the alterations wouldn't be permitted within a PSW. So within non-PSW wetlands, we go through the 3-step mitigation approach, which includes avoidance. So avoid impacts to wetlands at the planning stage. So we work with proponents to situate projects outside of the wetland and the 30-meter buffer zones. Then we try to minimize impacts to the extent possible. So applicable environmental protection measures during permitted alteration, reduce the project footprint in the wetland, things like that. And then if those are not possible, if we can't avoid and minimize wetland impacts, then we can consider compensation. So compensate for permanent wetland impacts that cannot be avoided or minimized, which are clearly demonstrated by the proponent through the review process. And wetland compensation refers to restoration, enhancement, or creation of wetland, which is usually at a 2-to-1 ratio. So I just wanted to go over a harvesting permit example. So this is one that I've actually received within the last year. So on the left-hand side, you can see the image, which I think this is what they sent in for their site plan, which was just basically a screenshot from the WAWA reference map, which outlines the mapped wetlands that are already mapped, the mapped watercourses, and their 30-meter buffers. The tricky part with this application is that there are forested wetlands on the map and also non-forested wetlands. So I think the non-forested wetland was a shrub wetland. And you can differentiate between the two when you're actually on the WAWA reference map. You can click on the wetland polygon and it'll tell you what type of wetland it is. So for this permit, this is typically what the description on the WAWA permit will look like if it's related to a harvesting activity. So it'll say that this project consists of timber harvesting in and within 30 meters of a forested wetland and at a maximum of 30% merchantable timber within 30 meters of a non-forested wetland, as well as a watercourse. So they are allowed to harvest up to 100% of the merchantable timber within the forested wetland, but only 30% within 30 meters of the non-forested wetland and the watercourse. So some of the typical conditions that we would include on this permit would be that there shall be no permanent impacts to a wetland to fulfill this project. So that means that there's going to be no soil disturbance, no grubbing, things like that, that would create a permanent impact. And any temporary impact to the wetland resulting from the project shall be completely restored to the original grade of the wetland immediately following the completion of the project. Soil disturbance, including grubbing, shall not take place within 30 meters of the wetland or the shoulder of the bank of the watercourse. The 15-meter and 30-meter wide buffers bordering The banks of the watercourses and the edges of the wetland shall be clearly delineated in the field prior to commencing harvesting operations. This one usually isn't always a requirement. So if you're just harvesting within a forested wetland, we wouldn't necessarily ask you to flag the boundary of the wetland. It's only really important when there is also a non-forested wetland involved, because we want to make sure that you know as the operator or the harvester that you know where the boundaries are, where you're allowed to operate and harvest only that 30%, because you're also, I think it's in the next, it's the next condition that machinery shall not track or be located within 30 meters of the shoulder of the bank of the watercourse or within 15 meters of a non-forested wetland. So that's where it's important to actually know where the boundary of the 15-meter and the 30-meter buffers are, so you can make sure that you're not accidentally tracking into those areas. So these are some more conditions. I won't read through all of these as it's quite lengthy. But in a forested wetland or within 30 meters of a non-forested wetland or the shoulder of the bank of the watercourse, at the first evidence of machinery cutting through the duff layer to the mineral soil, no deeper than 15 centimeters and longer than 4 meters, the machinery shall exit the 30-meter buffer and the rut shall be immediately smooth graded. So this one's essentially saying that no rutting is involved if it's more deeper than 15 centimeters and 15 centimeters deep and longer than 4 meters, then the machinery has to exit and the machinery won't be able to come back into the wetland unless it's operating on like swamp mats. So something to prevent the rutting happening within the forested wetland. And then no more than 30% of the merchantable trees within 30 meters of a non-forested wetland or the shoulder of the bank of the watercourse may be harvested from the same area once every 10 years. This goes into a bit more detail below. No more than 30% of the non-merchantable woody vegetation, so this is mostly pertaining to shrubs or smaller trees, evenly distributed, shall be cut within 6 meters of the shoulder of the bank of the watercourse. So within the 0 to 6 meter mark of a watercourse, you're only allowed to harvest up to 30%. And then you typically beyond that, unless it's within, I think there are different regulations. If it's a lake or a flood risk area, you can't harvest anything within 0 to 6 and only 30% up to the 6 meter mark. So depending on what the activity is and where it is, we'll add in different conditions to reflect what is permitted and what's not. Some more examples. Trees overhanging or rooted below the shoulder of the bank of the watercourse shall not be harvested. Trees and non-merchantable woody vegetation shall not be felled into or across a watercourse or in the open water portion of a wetland. All slash and woody debris generated must be cleaned up, essentially what that one says. And all harvested timber shall not be stacked in a wetland or within 15 meters of the shoulder of the bank of the watercourse. So the wetland conservation policy is really aimed at preventing the loss of provincially significant wetland habitat and to achieve the goal of no net loss of wetland function for all other wetlands. So wetland functions are the natural, physical, chemical, and biological processes that occur in wetlands. And wetland functions and values include, but are not limited to, groundwater recharge, flood control, shoreline stabilization, water quality control and purification, sediment and nutrient retention and export, habitat for fish, birds, and other wildlife, wetland products, recreation, education, and tourism, cultural value, and climate change mitigation. Just to touch on a few. So the wetland delineation process in the province, we do rely on private wetland delineators for a lot of our projects, especially the larger scale ones. So we as wetland biologists with the department, we can go out and delineate smaller scale properties. So typically if it's between an acre to 2 acres, we can go out and delineate the wetland ourselves for the applicant who applied for the permit, or anyone who's just wondering whether they have wetland on their property or they're proposing a project and they're just not sure. We are able to do that, but if it's any bigger than 1 to 2 acres, typically we'll refer the applicant to hire a professional wetland delineator. And so they accept wetland we accept wetland delineations based on the protocol for wetland delineation in New Brunswick, which includes the full report, the field data sheets, the site photos and shape files. And then these delineations are also used to update the WAWA reference map each year. So MCFT does host a list of wetland consultants who offer their services in New Brunswick, who are qualified to conduct wetland identification, delineation, and functional assessment. So this is a great tool to have if anyone ever asks, like, oh, I need to hire a delineator, how can I get in touch with one? I'll just send them the link to that site, and then they can take a look at the list of all the qualified consultants, and then they can pick and choose who they would like to contact or reach out to. So the qualifications, you do need the training in wetland identification and delineation, which is based on the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers delineation manual or equivalent pending review from the department. Education and or demonstrated experience in wetland hydrology, soils, botany, and other related sciences. And this is all subject to review and auditing by the department. And that is it. Thank you.